If you were just to read through Revelation chapter 13, and you read everything having to do with the beast and the false prophet and the mark of the beast and worshiping of the beast and everything like that, 666 or 666, depending on your viewpoint on that number, all those things, you get to the end of the chapter, and no matter what viewpoint you have on it, whether this is something that you can have a present understanding on, whether you can make an argument for a first century understanding of everything that's going on with the beast and the mark of the beast and everything like that, I think the question still looms in our minds, so what? Are the things that are listed in Revelation chapter 13 and even other places in the book of Revelation, is it there just for our information, for informational purposes, where we say, okay, I get it, that's how things are going to unfold? Or is there more to this that we need to see? I say the latter. And so when you ask the question, so what, the answer to that question is seen as you proceed into chapter 14. And it's going to go into areas that really on a bigger scale, when we look at the theme of Revelation, we hit that theme again where we talk about hope in Jesus Christ and victory in him because of what he's done for us. So there's hope that's supposed to be gained from the reader/listener of this book. And we're going to be introduced to that again in this portion of the book of Revelation. So in this episode, we're going to begin chapter 14. We've finished our study of chapter 13. We've spent several weeks in that chapter, and I hope that if you've been with us and if you've tracked with us in that study of chapter 13, I hope that there's clarity in that for you. But that's not the end of the story there. It's not the end of the message that we're supposed to get in relation to all of that. So we're going to start to explore that as we get into chapter 14. It's part of our longer study of this whole book of the book of Revelation. I think the journey has been good so far, and I hope it's been good for you as well. So I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. Yeah, so I really had a good time delving into this passage and into this chapter. I think we have some good things in store as we explore chapter 14 of Revelation. I anticipate that it'll be 3 episodes at the most that we'll be spending in Revelation chapter 14. We spent, I think, 6 episodes in chapter 13. And I have no regrets of that whatsoever. I think that it was totally necessary given what we were dealing with and given the viewpoints that people have on that. So, you need to take a little bit of time to kind of explain where you're coming from, why you believe what you do about the passages in question, why I don't believe that other explanations that are provided are adequate and those sorts of things. And listen, in after going through all of those, all of that analysis, I hope that at the very least it's caused you to go back and explore Scripture for yourself, do a little bit of more digging on your own, and just kind of. I hope that this is something that enhances your desire for Bible study and studying the Scriptures and getting deep into it. So yeah, before we get into chapter 14, you know what time it is. You know what time it is. This is the time that has come up on just about every episode for the past, 3 months maybe? I don't know. I've lost track. But I will continue to do my shameless plug, probably for as long as we're in the book of Revelation anyway. And who knows, maybe even after that, because the book will be available after we're done with our study of Revelation. But anyway, shameless plug. For my book, Signs of the End, What Did Jesus Say About His Own Return and the Events That Point to It? A book about Jesus' words to his disciples in the Olivet Discourse. So we're talking, again, Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. Disciples ask, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus goes in and explains to the disciples and things to answer their question. What did Jesus mean in all of those things? That's what that book is about, as well as some other things connected to there that I think would be to the reader's interest, at least I hope anyway. So Signs of the End by me, Steve Gill. You can get that on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. Don't forget, you can also purchase that electronically on Kindle if you so desire. So that is also an option as well. So there we go. Shameless plug is we can put a check in that checkbox. So. All right, so Revelation chapter 14, like I said before, we finished talking about Revelation chapter 13 and the beast and the second beast, the mark of the beast, all of those things that really, I guess for people who maybe aren't afraid of reading about or talking about eschatology or last things or reading the book of Revelation, it seems like those are the things that really catches people's attention, and there's a certain level of interest as far as those things go. And I think some of that interest, though, at least on one side of the debate, is kind of what's attached to that interest is a viewpoint that looks at things that are yet future and looking at Revelation 13 in that light. And so when things come up in the present, we think, oh, is this what Revelation 13 was all about? Is this what the mark of the beast was all about, and everything like that? Just to remind you, and again, we don't need to go into painful detail of everything that we've talked about in Revelation chapter 13. If you're joining us for the first time, you can go back to those episodes and listen to those yourself. Or if you've listened to those and you just need a reminder, you can go back and listen to those episodes again. Even though a few of them are quite lengthy. I didn't plan for that. It's just how it turned out. But one thing, a couple of things to remind you of, as far as the beast and everything, I think that what we're dealing with is a conglomeration of nations and kingdoms that take on an anti-Christian air to them. And that is ultimately expressed in their persecution of God's people. And that's something that you see between the first and second comings of Christ. So in other words, the beast in Revelation 13 isn't an individual, or an end times antichrist figure. Although I do believe in the end time antichrist figure, I don't think that the beast in Revelation 13 is describing him. I think that that's something that's totally different. You see the second beast that, you kind of have false religion, false prophecy thrown into the mix and everything like that. And the whole goal is to deceive the people of the earth who are worshiping the beast. And I think the term that I've used a few times throughout this whole study is that the beast and the kingdoms and the people of the earth, those who indwell the earth, the inhabitants of the earth, a phrase that Revelation uses over and over again to describe unbelievers, they are of kindred spirits. So that's why they marvel at the beast, especially when it sees the head that was wounded but is healed. And I talked about last time about what kind of goes into that whole thing in connection with Nero. So the whole thing with 666, which I believe that's how you say the number, the mark of the beast, is a sum that's brought up by Gematria, where you take the transliterated name of Nero from the Greek to the Hebrew, Neron Kaiser, to the Hebrew, and take the Hebrew letters and the gematria values of that, add those up, and you get 666. And that was designed to point the readers of Revelation back to Nero. Not to say that Nero was the beast. I think Nero was a beast. He was an expression. He was a manifestation of the beast, one out of many that will appear, that would appear in human history between the first and second comings of Christ, but one that the people in the first century would have been familiar with. And with a lot of the people in first century Asia Minor going through hard times and persecution already, this was something to point them back to Nero and saying, does this look familiar? This kind of looks like what you have with Nero. And so you have people taking this mark of the beast, like, people back in Nero's time did, in the sense that they bought into the whole pantheistic system of religion back at that time, and were totally against Christians, followers of Christ, because they refused to participate in things of society that were so tied into pagan religion. So when Nero persecutes Christians, when he did back in the late 60s AD of the first century, you didn't really have a lot of uproar in objection from those people. And so I think that in some way that kind of explains, maybe not fully, totally, but in some way, in a way that the first century audience understands, the whole thing of the head that's wounded, just kind of that kind of depicting that resurrection of Nero, the legend that people believed back at that time. And this was, John's way through interpreting the vision of saying that this is kind of what that is, except it's not a literal return of the literal actual Nero, but in the spirit of Nero, this is what you're experiencing right now, a resurrection of those things. And you have people, of the earth who are in line with the beast, which I think Domitian, you can obviously say is another manifestation of that beast. That all of that is supposed to give the first century audience an understanding of what's going on around them. Okay, so really what you have going on here is you have churches that are in dire straits, and that's nothing new. We've gone over that before. You get the sense of that with some of the churches when you read the letters that were written to them in chapters 2 and chapter 3. Now we have to, now we see, things, just kind of described in a little bit more heightened form. In chapter 13, we see the saints that are conquered and being persecuted by the beast. We see false religion rising up every which way. You see people being forced to take the mark of the beast and all those sorts of things. It's very harrowing for the people of God. So the question would be, how are the saints, as we see them in Revelation chapter 13, in dire straits? How are they going to survive? What sort of thing can we say to those believers that will give them hope? And that's where you get into chapter 14. So when you read and you get to the end of chapter 13, even with what we talked about, and even with what I said as far as how to look at this from a first century perspective, the question still remains: so what? Well, that question is answered once we get into chapter 14. Okay, and so we're going to just take the initial verses here of verses 1 through 5 here of Revelation chapter 14. So let me read that here so we can understand what we're dealing with here as we continue our study here. So Revelation chapter 14, starting in verse 1, and it says, "Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters, and like the sound of sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps, and they were singing a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been redeemed from mankind as firstfruits for God and the Lamb, and in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless." Okay, so that is what we have with chapter 14. And so if you remember, I kind of laid out some things just kind of as a little bit of a preview last time of what we're going to look at now, just when we're talking about chapter 14 here. And I think one of the things that I mentioned, if you remember, is that when we look at chapter 14, in a few places, what we see here is contrast between what we've just been exposed to in chapter 13 and what we see here in chapter 14, which obviously is a heavenly scene here. Okay, so the contrast of, I think the first very obvious contrast is seen when you compare chapter 13 with what we just saw with the mark of the beast. Remember, the mark of the beast, the false prophet, causes people to get the mark on their hand or on their forehead. But here in chapter 14, it says, when it talks about these 144,000, it says that these are people, these 144,000 had his name, the Lamb, his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And again, I think this is all the more clear of an understanding that when we're talking about the mark of the beast in chapter 13, we're not dealing with something where there's a literal something on or inside your hand or on your forehead. Because we don't look at the name of the Lamb and of the Father written on a believer's foreheads as something that's literal. Most people, at least what I've read, understand that to be symbolic. So, especially here in chapter 14, if we're dealing with contrast, I think that points all the more to the fact that in chapter 13, when it comes to the mark of the beast, we're not dealing with something that's literal in the hand or in the forehead, a microchip, a barcode, so forth and so on. We talked about all that stuff the last couple times. But there you see the clear contrast, where people are getting the mark of the beast on their hand or on their forehead. Here you have in this heavenly scene the name of the Lamb and of his father's and the name of his father written on their foreheads, the 144,000. Now let's talk about this 144,000 just real quickly. It's been a while since we've talked about the 144,000 because we saw them way back in chapter 7, and I believe around the time last year that we were talking about that, we were going through Revelation chapter 7. I think that was it was sometime in the summer of last year. So like June or July-ish, I think, if I remember correctly. So it has been a while. But if you remember, and if you've been with us for that long, and we talked about the 144,000 that show up in Revelation chapter 7, that it says that there are 144,000 Jews that are sealed. And remember the seal that was mentioned before, before it lists the tribes of these 144,000 in chapter 7. Let me just read it here again, just to refresh our memory. In chapter 7, I'll just read the first 3 verses here. Where it says, "After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, that no wind might blow on earth or sea or against any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, with the seal of the living God." So there's the seal that we're talking about. "And he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm earth and sea, saying, 'Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads.'" Okay, so there's the whole thing with sealing them on the foreheads. And then in verse 4, as it says, "And I heard the number of the sealed, 144 sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel." Now, it would take several minutes to explain, the whole thing of the 144,000 and everything that we laid out there, to demonstrate that what we're talking about there is not a literal numbering of 144,000 ethnic Jews, but the way that the list is laid out there. If you compare this, how it shows up in Revelation 7 to what you see in Genesis chapter 35, and the differences between the names and the listings there, what's meant to be communicated in Revelation chapter 7 is that we're dealing with the whole people of God, both Jews and Gentiles. We see the same thing with the great multitude representing the same group of people, but just described differently in a different symbolic vision. But really, just all of that to say, 144,000, we're dealing with the complete people of God. 12 times 12, maybe you can say that the 2 12s, are the, as part of the complete people of God. 12 on its own is a representation of the complete people of God in Revelation. You have 12 times 12 times 1,000. So you have 2 12s there. Perhaps you're pointing to the whole thing of the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles in the New Testament. Times 1,000, which is a large number, which is supposed to show, the total completeness and the vast number of what you're dealing with there. Again, even after 144,000 in chapter 7, you have a great multitude from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation that's shown up there. So really, we're, just the different pictures that we see. But I think it would suffice to say that what we're dealing with here with 144,000 And what we've seen it represent before, and I believe what we're seeing again now, is that it's representing the complete people of God. I mean, just as it relates to, Jews and Gentiles, and just the fact that they're even as we're going to see here in chapter 14, purchased from all over the earth, or, redeemed from all mankind, that sort of thing. So it's supposed to represent a wide range of people from everywhere who are redeemed, and they are sealed, again, as we saw in chapter 7, on their foreheads. And remember, we're talking about a seal. We're talking about something that shows possession and protection, okay? Which is something, which, by the way, the protection is something that the people who get the mark of the beast doesn't provide them any kind of protection. And that's going to become all the more clear the further we go into chapter 14, okay? That seal, or I guess you could say the mark that the people of the earth got, does not protect them from the wrath of God, okay? So it does nothing for them. But the seal that God's people get on their foreheads is a totally different story, okay? And that seal shows that we belong to God and that we are under His protection, okay? And so, given everything that we see here, okay, or what we have seen in chapter 13, again, with chapter 13, it seems like you have all sorts of bad things going on here. Maybe in some sense, with all the time that we spent unpacking those verses, maybe it was a little wearisome because the picture looked so dire. But let not your heart be troubled, because you have chapter 14 here. So with chapter 13, maybe even with people in the first century, the question could be, okay, with all of this going on, with the beast, the false beast, with persecution, all those sorts of things, where is God? Have you ever asked that personally in your own mind? If you're ever going through your own personal trials, your own personal troubles, persecution or not, I mean, just anything that's just really hard for you to handle, and it seems like heaven is silent, you might ask the question, might ask, where is God? It feels like God is distant, or that He's not listening, or, whatever the case may be. I don't know. I don't want to, a lot of you might know that sort of feeling. Maybe you've asked that question, even though deep down in your spirit, you know where God is. You know that God is with you. It's just the feeling within the moment. Where is God in all of this? Now, I'm not saying that that's what the first century audience was thinking. I don't know what they were thinking. But again, what we see in chapter 13 are things that, the first century audience would have been very familiar with. So what's the purpose of laying out these things that they would have been familiar with and that they're experiencing right now? Answer, chapter 14, to give them the hope that they have. So in chapter 14, it starts out, it says, "Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb." Okay? And it's just amazing just how he's just there. Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion, hey, there's the Lamb. So if you want to ask the question, where is God? Well, there He is right there. John says, I see Him. So the Lamb is there. Our Savior is there. He's not off taking a vacation, or, just an absentee ruler. You remember, and that's just interesting, because you remember way back when we were in chapter 1, remember what we saw in the vision right before chapter 2, when we get into the letters to the churches in Asia Minor, how it says that the Son of Man is walking among the lampstands. It spoke of His presence with His churches. And it shows you that Jesus Christ is not an absentee ruler. He's not off. He's not far off. He's among His people. He's among His churches. And so that's what you see here. So with all the things that you see going on in chapter 13, chapter 14, John says, "Behold, I saw, and there's the Lamb. There He is." So He's not gone. And remember, we've seen different instances of His sovereignty, just as several of these other visions that we've seen in the book of Revelation have unfolded. We've seen it in chapter 6. We've even seen it in the last chapter, in chapter 13, of authority being allowed to be given to the beast and everything like that. All of these things are in the sight of God, and God is either directly orchestrating those things, or He's removing his hand and allowing certain things to happen. But whatever the case may be, it's all so that they can work out to his perfect divine purposes. Okay. But the point is, and the encouraging thing that we see here, we're going to see a lot of encouraging things, but the encouraging thing here that we see is that the Lamb is there. He's not gone. He's not far away. He's there. John sees him. Okay. And it says that he sees them, behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb. Okay. Now, Mount Zion, this is a very interesting thing as it relates to Mount Zion. And Mount Zion, that designation of what we see here in chapter 14 says a lot. And again, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you'll understand this. Now, just as far as what we're dealing with in this section in chapter 14, I think it's very clear that we're dealing with a heavenly scene, or at least something that's supposed to put our mind into a heavenly perspective. And I say that because of what we see here with in the middle of verse 3. Let me read verse 3. It says, "And they were singing a new song before the throne." And we've seen that the throne has been in heaven in chapter 4 and chapter 5. And before the four living creatures and before the elders, those that we also saw in chapter 4 and chapter 5, when the scene that we were looking at was in heaven. Remember at the beginning of chapter 4, when the voice called from heaven to John and says, "Come up here and I will show you what must take place after this." And then John was taken up into heaven. Okay, so there we see things that we've encountered before in our study here from chapter 4 and chapter 5 in the heavenly scene, and we see them here in chapter 14, which would give us a clue that the scene that we're dealing with here is heavenly. Now, how does that explain Mount Zion? Because, somebody can look at this and say Mount Zion, well, that's obviously something on earth having to do with Jerusalem. Well, here's the thing, in a couple of areas. One thing is that, what can be brought to your mind is places like Hebrews chapter 12. I want to say verse 22. I think if not that exactly, and somewhere around there, where it talks about, but you have come to Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem. So there you see a connection between Mount Zion and a heavenly perspective as it relates to Jerusalem. There's a heavenly Jerusalem that's spoken of in that book. Okay. And so in a very real way, you can be dealing with the same thing here with Mount Zion. But even more significant than that, even anything that not having to do with location, whether it's in heaven or on earth or anything like that, but the fact that Mount Zion is even mentioned here should say a lot to the hearers of the book of Revelation as this is being read to the first century audience. Again, if you understand the Old Testament or recognize the references from the Old Testament, which I think the first century audience did. And I think mainly what we're dealing with here is places like Psalm chapter 2. Now, Psalm chapter 2 is a very popular psalm. So, this might not be familiar to many of us today. And it's something that's repeated in certain verses anyway, that's repeated in other places in the New Testament. But in Psalm chapter 2, remember, this is having to do with the Messiah himself. Remember, it says, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in heaven laughs, the Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill." Okay. So there you go. And then if you read further in some of the other verses, let me just read through verse 9 again here, where it says, I will tell the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. So really in all of that, the one thing that you're really dealing with there is the installment of the Messiah as the ruler and as the king over all the earth, and one who takes possession of the entire earth as part of his rulership. Now, I don't think that that's something that's speaking of something exclusively future. Because we think of the rule of Christ, we think of the kingdom of Christ, we think of him as king, we think of something that's future and saying, oh, he's going to begin to reign when he returns to earth. He will reign when he returns to earth, but he's reigning right now. Remember what he said in Matthew 28, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. He's ruling right now. I believe that Psalm 2 is fulfilled right now. You're familiar with the whole term of him seated at the right hand of the Father. That's a position of honor and power and authority, right? So we're familiar with that. I mean, we've even seen, even in Revelation in chapter 12, when it's talking about the birth of the Messiah child, and then it being ascended up into heaven, into the throne of the Father. You know, why is it saying he ascends to the throne of the Father? Because it's from there that the Christ is going to rule. And that he is ruling right now, okay? And so that's what we're dealing with there. So the whole thing of, I set my king on Zion, my holy hill. And remember, this is one said that's the words that are said from somebody, as it says there in Psalm 2, who is seated in heaven. So we're dealing with a heavenly rule, a God and a Savior who is in control right now. And so when we go here in chapter 14, it says, then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb. I think the idea that you're supposed to get there is that you're dealing with the Lamb who rules and he reigns. Okay, he's the one who's ultimately in charge. When you look at chapter 13, if you leave things at just in chapter 13, you can be left with the question, okay, where's God, number one, and number two, who's in charge of all of this? Chapter 14, the Lamb, you show that, oh, he is God, and oh, he's the one who's in control. That's what that's supposed to communicate there. So to the first century audience, this is a great deal of comfort, because John is essentially saying, look, your king is right here. Your king is there. He hasn't gone away, and he still rules, and he's still in charge. Everything that you're seeing here is all a part of his purposes. Okay. And not only that, though, but again, just to remind you, and then I guess, just as you go further here, it says, when he says that you saw, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, what else did John see? And with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And again, so we talked about that. And so if that's supposed to talk about, the 144,000 is talking about the people of God, and the fact that they have the seal on their forehead, remember, that shows that they are people who belong to Christ, and they are protected by him as well. And you might think, well, that doesn't sound like a lot of protection if you have people who are dying and things like that. Well, I would think, again, especially when you get to, places like verse 13. We'll talk, in verse 13, in all likelihood, we'll talk about next time. But whether you're alive on this earth or whether you're killed, number one, it's not outside of God's eternal purposes, and number two, it really doesn't have any sort of adverse effect on you spiritually. If you're killed and you die here on this earth, then you're just with the Lord, right? Because you belong to him. You go to the person to whom you belong. That's a good thing, and that goes back to the whole thing of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10. Don't be afraid of the one who can don't be afraid of the one who can kill the body but can't kill the soul. Somebody can kill the body, but they can't do anything to your soul. The state of your soul, if it's in Christ, is already set and it's permanent. You permanently belong to him, okay? And so that's what you have to remember here. So where is God? There he is on Mount Zion, which is supposed to depict his, the whole thing of him being established as Messiah, as ruler, as king, as one who is in charge, I believe. Okay? And then in verse 2, it says, and I heard a voice from heaven like a roar of many waters and like the sound of loud thunder. So the sound of many waters, we saw that, and we've heard that before, way back in the beginning of chapter 1, when John is describing his vision of the resurrected Christ. And one of the things that he said there in chapter 1 is that his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. And of course, that comes from the Old Testament description that you read in places like Ezekiel. Okay, so we're hearing the voice of the Son of God, right? And along with that, it's talking about the sound of loud thunder, So again, you get this sense, even when you put those two things together, you get the sense of power, of strength, and of authority and that sort of thing, especially when you're talking about the thunder. Every time I think about thunder in this context, I think about Mount Sinai and when God is coming down and he's descending in a cloud on Mount Sinai, and there was rumblings and peals of thunder and that sort of thing. It was a very terrifying scene, but it was God coming to his people. Right. And so and there was a lot of power in that display. And I think that's the same thing that you have here. But it's interesting that even along with that, attached to that, still in the middle of verse 2, it says, the voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing their harps, which is very interesting. So you have the sound of rushing waters, and then you have a loud thunder, all describing the voice. And then apparently with the same voice, it sounds like the sound of many harpists playing their harp. Which, you kind of think about that and you think of something that's a little bit more tranquil. And maybe that's the whole point. Because even though there's power and authority, there's also peace and comfort in the Lamb and in the Father as well, because you belong to him. And maybe that's the idea. And also related to that, I think that you can't miss the connection that you have between the harp, the mention of the harp here, and the music of harps in Revelation chapter 5. The earlier heavenly vision that we looked at before. It says that the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders had harps to play, and so there's that element of worship. And so as part of the voice there that comes from heaven, it sounds like a harp. Now, that's not to say that the God of heaven is speaking things of worship or anything, not to anybody or anything else, obviously. But perhaps that's mentioned to point our minds back to that heavenly scene and saying, this is what you're dealing with again here. Which isn't hard to understand because, again, you have the reappearance of the elders and the 4 living creatures, again, that we saw in that heavenly scene in chapter 4 and chapter 5. Okay. But so you have that, and then you get into verse 3, and it says, and they were singing a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and before the elders. Okay. Now, this whole thing of new song, again, this takes us back to things that we looked at before in the heavenly scene in Revelation, specifically in chapter 5. Remember again, with the 4 living creatures and with the elders and everything. Let me in that chapter, let me go to verse 8, and then leading into verse 9 here. So it says, and when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp. So there's the whole thing with the harp. And golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. Now, verse 9, it says, and they sang a new song. So there's a whole thing of a new song again. So new song in heaven here in chapter 5, a new song in heaven in chapter 14. But here in chapter 5, let me remind you again of what we're dealing with here. Again, in verse 9, it says, and they sang a new song, saying, worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth. Okay. Now I emphasize that whole thing of the whole thing where it says you ransom people for God, because the whole thing of new song, I think that's kind of what you're dealing with there when we're talking about what's these 144,000, these people of God who are worshiping before the throne, this and singing this new song, because this new song, I believe, has a lot to do with ransom or redemption or purchasing. And it's even mentioned here in chapter 14. We're going to see that here in a bit. But even when you look at, the whole concept of new song, even as it relates to, passages that you see in the Old Testament, you see that the connection of a new song can be, mentioning of a new song can be connected to salvation. And not only salvation, but that salvation being declared to people throughout all the earth, right? and letting the whole earth and all the peoples know of the salvation of God. Okay. And if you were to read, we don't have to go in and look at these places specifically. If you want to on your own, you can. But if you go to places like Psalm 96 and Psalm 98, those are two very good examples of that, of the new song, and how that's connected to salvation, and how that salvation is declared to all the earth. Now, again, that connection is important to chapter 14, because we understand, and what we learn about these 144,000 is that these are people who are redeemed from the earth, and they are redeemed from mankind. Okay, we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But I mean, you talk about this new song. I think that what you're dealing with here is this redemption song, if that's what you want to call it, really. And it says, and they were singing a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and before the elders. Which, by the way, and you'll see why here in a second. But if you recall our analysis on the living creatures and the elders from chapter 4, you remember that I said that I believe that both of those descriptions there, the elders and the four living creatures, are both describing an order of angels. Okay. For different reasons. I mean, I don't want to go into a whole thing there, but here's one thing also that I think is very interesting and is very telling, just as it relates to that whole thing, because as it says there, in the middle of verse 3, it says, no one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. Okay. So it's interesting. So the 144,000 are the only ones who could learn the song. Okay. And notice this isn't a song that they just came up with on their own, and they just kind of, put their own words to it or whatever like that. It was just the 144,000, and they learned it, and maybe that has something to do with, based on the experience, the shared experience of these 144,000, which again represents the people of God. But the whole thing that it says there is that the description that's attached to them, it says that they were redeemed from the earth. Now think about angels. Angels are not people who are redeemed. They're not redeemed creatures, especially righteous angels, because there's nothing that they need to be redeemed from. And fallen angels, we know that God hasn't redeemed fallen angels. Their fate is sealed, right? And so with the four living creatures, I think that's understandable. But even with the elders couldn't learn this song that the 144,000 learn, because it's connected, I believe, to their redemption. I think that's why that description is laid out there, those people who had been redeemed from the earth. And if you're talking about that as far as redemption, that's something that only people who are redeemed can really sing about to the Lamb, because they've experienced his redemption. The angels, i.e. the elders and the four living creatures, do not. And so here's the thing, though. Let's be honest about something here. In chapter 5, we do have the elders and the four living creatures, where it's saying that they sang a new song, saying, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain in by your blood, and you ransomed people for God," and everything like that. So they are singing a new song to God about redemption, but you notice there that it's not something that they attribute, to their own experience. They didn't say, "For you ransomed us for God from every tribe and language and people and nation." It says, "And by your blood you ransomed people for God." That's very telling. So here in chapter 14, when you have this new song sung by 144,000 people, the people of God who are redeemed from the earth, and this is a song that only they could learn, I think the sense that you get here is that the new song that we're dealing with in chapter 14 is something that is a little bit more personal. And personal in the sense that this is praise that's offered directly to God about what God has done directly for them. So in other words, this probably isn't something that is sung to God that's mentioned in the third person, like we see in chapter 5. And the song that the four living creatures and the elders, they could be singing that to what they sang in chapter 5 as well in the third person, but it's just not the new song that we're seeing here in chapter 14 that only the 144,000 could learn. Okay, because that one is a little bit more personal, and that's because it's dealing with people who have been redeemed from the earth, people who have experienced redemption. Angels have not experienced that, and so that's not a personal sort of new song that they themselves could learn and could sing, because it's outside of their experience, okay? And so that's what I think that you have there. So you have these people who are worshiping God for his salvific work and redeeming them from the earth. Now think about this for a second here. This is very important, because what we've seen in chapter 13, you look at this and you look at the dire situation. Not only do you have saints who are being persecuted, but you look at the inhabitants of the earth, and they are glorying in the beast. And they love the beast, and they're worshiping the beast. They're awed by the beast and everything like that. And it just looks like everybody's heart is turned. And I don't know. From an observer's perspective, it can look like, man, this looks irreversible, because everything just seems so ensconced here, and things aren't getting better. It seems like they're getting worse. But here we see 144,000 who have been redeemed from the earth. And I think one of the things that we're going to learn as we continue on here and even further down into chapter 14 is that what we see in chapter 13 isn't necessarily the final picture of what we see. And I think that what we're dealing with there, even with people that we've encountered in chapter 13, is that there are people who can and will be redeemed from that number, people who have been worshiping the beast and will be part of the number who are singing this new song. They would be part of the 144,000, which again is not something that's meant to be literal. It's supposed to be something that's supposed to represent, in symbolic way, the complete people of God. Okay? And I think that that's what you're dealing with there. So these people themselves, redeemed from the earth, could we honestly say that these are people who, fit the description before of what we read in chapter 13 of people who worship the beast? Yes. And now you see this? This is awesome. This is beautiful. This is amazing. Which is going to tell us something else here, pretty significant as well. But I'll get to that here in a minute, in a little bit. But so in verse 4, it says, I guess here, starting in verse 4, you see like three series of things where it says it is these who, or these are the people who, so we get kind of a thrice-fold description of these 144,000, which I think is something that describes the results or the after effects of their redemption, of them having been redeemed from the earth. Okay, so let's take a look at these as they're starting to be laid out in verse 4. So in verse 4, it says, "It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins." So this is something that's supposed to point to their purity. I think clearly that's what we're supposed to gain from this. Now you can look at this in a couple different ways. You can see this as people who, I say these are people who didn't commit any sort of adultery or sexual immorality in the spiritual sense as it relates to worshiping the beast and everything like that. But if we're talking about people who've been redeemed from the earth and the good possibility that these were people who had been part of that number in chapter 13, I think, maybe another explanation would do. I think purity is the name of the game here, just as it relates to the explanation of that. But I think one thing that's very interesting is that when it came to the Israelite army and them coming up against the enemy, one of the requirements is that they keep themselves from sexual intercourse with women. Even outside of the whole thing having to do with the army, and when you know that you're going to be in the presence of God. For example, I think it's in places like Exodus chapter 19, before God descends on Mount Sinai, It says, be sure that they don't engage in sexual relations. What was that whole thing? Is that they were supposed to remain pure in preparation for that time when they were going to be in the presence of God right there at Mount Sinai, even though they did have to keep some distance, that they couldn't touch the mountain and everything like that. You think about Deuteronomy chapter 23, and it talks about when Israel is encamped against the enemy. If people in the army, if there's somebody who has a nocturnal emission, he's supposed to go outside the camp before and cleanse himself, because he's unclean then. And that could be bad news for the army. So you're dealing with somebody in that situation who's not battle ready, right? And there's sort of an impurity there that causes that person to have to go outside the camp. And then you think about if you remember when David, let me turn here. I mean, it's not a huge passage or anything, but when David was running away from Saul in 1 Samuel chapter, what chapter was it actually? I believe it's chapter 21. Let me see if I'm right. Yep. Okay. So when David is running away from Saul, if you look here, I'll just start at the beginning here. It's only a few verses here in 1 Samuel chapter 21, where it says, "Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came to meet David trembling and said to him, 'Why are you alone and no one with you?' And David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has charged me with a matter and said to me, 'Let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here.' And the priest, here it is, and the priest answered David, 'I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have kept themselves from women.'" So even when handling the the holy things, or as it says here, it's not common bread, but it's the holy bread. In other words, that's just another way of describing the bread of the presence. Ahimelech is saying, well, you can have that, but I mean, the stipulation is that they had to have been kept from women. And David, says, indeed, they have been kept from women and so forth and so on. But, there you see the regulation of the time. And so, the whole thing of them being pure in that time. Now, sexual intercourse in and of itself is not bad, as long as it's within God's parameters and if it's within God's guidelines. The fact that God would say in those certain situations to keep yourselves from women isn't to say that sex is bad, but it does say something about what it means to be pure before a holy God. And so, in the duties that they were supposed to discharge and everything like that, that was a regulation. It was supposed to picture purity in the presence of God as they were carrying out these certain functions, for God and everything like that. And so, could it be, as it relates to chapter 14 here in Revelation, that's what you're dealing with, and that's what's kind of being pictured here. And so in other words, let's put it like this: the description here, it says, it is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. Could this be a description of people now that they have been redeemed from the earth and that they belong to God and they belong to Christ? That these are people who are battle ready. Okay, that these are people who are battle ready to do the service of God as warriors of Him. I think there's a very good possibility that's what's being referred to there, and that's the understanding that we're supposed to have as it relates to all of this. Now, the whole thing where it says "for they are virgins." Again, I think that's supposed to show you the level at which that their devotion is what the level of their devotion to God as it relates to this. And in a certain sense, I think it does have something to do with staying away from those things that corrupt, and having full and total devotion to God as opposed to other things. Maybe not necessarily the things that we've talked about in Revelation chapter 13, but again, it's just talking about the just the status that's described there is, what's being depicted there is saying that these are people who are single-minded, devout and devoted people to God, battle ready as his servants, who are in the position because they've been redeemed, to carry out his service for him. Okay. All right. Which shows you something pretty amazing, by the way. Because this is, with everything that's going on in chapter 13, you might think, okay, how is God going to move in an environment like this? Well, don't worry. These are people who have been set apart, have been redeemed, and they are depicted as battle-ready servants of God to do the work of God, and with total 100% devotion and dedication to Him. For it says, for they are virgins. They don't let anything else corrupt, that single-minded purpose that they have attached to the Lamb and attached to the Father. Okay. It says thereafter that it says, it is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. Okay. And so I think that here, I think what you have here is a description of something that's a little bit more relational. I think it's a very interesting picture that's painted for us here. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. If you think about the servants of God in its most ideal form, in its most ideal picture, you see that these are people who wouldn't dare try and do anything apart from their Savior in heaven. Okay, this is a heavenly picture of people who've not only been redeemed by the Lamb, because of his sacrifice, but now as it relates to that, you have the servants, the people of God, who say that we will wholly attach ourselves to the Lamb. So wherever he goes, we go. It's a matter of being wholehearted disciples of him, following him wherever he goes, being allowed to be led and guided by him, and going wherever he tells you to go, and wherever he leads you, and wherever he guides you. But even also in addition to that and attached to that, if we're talking about people who go wherever the Lamb goes, I think the idea here is that you have people who are what's the right way of putting this? Who are always looking to be in the presence of the Lamb, and always wanting to have a conscious thought of being in the presence of the Lamb and being in the presence of God, which is something which would be totally important for Christians to understand on earth, who are going through the harrowing times that they are under the oppression of the beast and under the oppression of the second beast, or the false prophet. What better person to be in the presence of than God himself? And saying that, I totally surrender myself to being in the presence of God this whole time, because if I go anywhere else, if I detach myself from him, I'm done for. It's so I think what you have here is a picture of relationship, but also of strict dependency and a desire to constantly be in the Lord's presence, especially in an environment like we see in chapter 13, right? They go wherever the Lamb goes. Far be it from them to say the Lamb goes this way, well, we're going to go this way. We'll just split up. We have the same goal. We have the same mission, but you go this way and I'll go this way, and then we'll come to the same results. No. It will not do for these people if they are apart from Christ. So wherever the Lamb goes, they go as well. There's a relational and a dependency aspect to this that I think is very incredible here. Okay, so we've seen that these are ones who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes, right? Which, by the way, notice the contrast here between what you see here in chapter 14 and what you see before in chapter 13. Because in chapter 13, as it relates to the beast, it says, let's see, in the middle of verse 3, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast, and they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast. So you see all this contrast that's happening here. That's the description in chapter 13 of the people of the earth as it relates to the beast. Here in the heavenly picture of chapter 14, you have the worship of you have the worship of the Lamb, them worshiping the Lamb. You have the seal on the forehead, so there's the mark, so to speak. And you see that these are people who are following the Lamb, whereas everybody else in chapter 13 is following the beast. So these are people who are not going to detach themselves from Christ for anything, even with everything that's going on in chapter 13, with the threat of persecution and death and everything like that. They stick to the Savior like glue, okay? And so then after that, it says, these have been redeemed from mankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb. So these are people who are redeemed, as we mentioned before. And again, that's, with the song that we saw in chapter 5, it says, you ransom people from every tribe, tongue, people, language, and, that sort of thing. These are people who have been redeemed. Now, notice the description here first of all, from mankind, which I think, again, shows you that when it comes to this 144,000, we're not dealing with a literal 144,000 of literal ethnic Jews. The Jewish ethnicity, as described in chapter 7, is symbolic. And again, we went over all of that, before. I don't want to go over it again here. But again, these 144,000 that reappear, and this time they're in a heavenly scene. These are ones who have been redeemed from mankind. Okay, which kind of gives you a more universal sense of things here, not just of one group, but and again, if we do the comparison with what we've seen in chapter 5, what did it say in chapter 5? Remember, it says that that they were redeemed, that you redeemed people from every tribe and language and people and nation, and of course, again, that's something that we saw in chapter 7, right? And so here again, we see, it just using very different descriptive words, but along the same lines here, you have that whole thing of, they were redeemed from mankind. Now notice here, as first fruits for God and the Lamb. Okay. So these are first fruits from the Lamb and for the Lamb and for God. Now the biblical concept of first fruits, especially when it came to offerings and stuff like this, was something agricultural. And so, like, offering the first fruits of your yield back at that time, you offered the first fruits, and that was something that was given to God, the first of your crop, and that was something that was to express the confidence that God would bring about the rest of the yield later on. So there was a thought of a guarantee of a greater yield, following that first yield that was offered to God. So really, when we talk about first fruits, the whole idea is there's more of a crop to follow. Okay, now that has agricultural overtones, but that term of first fruits can be used in other contexts as well. I think an obvious one is in 1 Corinthians 15 when it talks about the resurrection. It talks about how Christ is the first fruits from the dead. In other words, that means, and this is true, is that because Christ has been raised, we also will be raised. So Christ is the first fruits of that, which is a guaranteeing of the resurrection that comes later, which is going to be our resurrection, right? We are the ones who are going to be raised. And as 1 Corinthians 15 says, that's going to happen when Christ comes back, right? So as it relates to first fruits here, it says, as first fruits for God and the Lamb. So what's that saying there? I mean, what we see with these 144,000, this is just an installment that shows the guarantee of more of a crop to come up later, which means that, we have more salvation to go that happens over here. So again, understand what this says in light of what we've seen in chapter 13. Chapter 13, we've seen some dire things here. And in that whole scene of what we saw in chapter 13, we might think nobody else is going to be coming to faith. Chapter 14 would say, oh, really? That's not beyond God's purview. These 144,000 are a proof of that. And again, these aren't people that just came out of nowhere. These are people, These are people who are just as much a part of the inhabitants of the earth as described in Revelation as anybody else would be. They were redeemed from the earth. They came from that same environment. And here they are described as first fruits, which means that there's more fruit to come. So in other words, what we're seeing here, and if we're looking at this whole thing as things that are happening between the first and second comings of Christ, what we see and what we have to be reminded of is that until Christ comes back, he always has work to do in saving people. That means that there are people in the description that we see in chapter 13 who have given their allegiance to the beast, who worship the beast, who worship the dragon and everything like that. There are people from that number who will continue to be redeemed until time is up. Now, of course, not everybody is going to be saved. There are going to be people in that number who make up the inhabitants of the earth, or those who dwell on the earth. Revelation's description of unbelievers, and it's going to be too late for them. They won't repent. And we're going to see that later on in this chapter, in chapter 14. Okay, but it's just amazing though that none of the things that you saw in chapter 13 is going to stifle God's work in the here and now. People are still going to get saved. And maybe you can testify to the fact, maybe on a more personal level, of maybe people that you knew or people that you know right now who are Christians now, but you remember them from their non-believing days. Maybe they were people who mocked Christians. Maybe they cursed God. Maybe they said all sorts of things against believers and things like that. And you might have thought, maybe not consciously, maybe, but even unconsciously, you thought that dude will never get saved. And then lo and behold, God gets a hold of them. They hear the gospel in its fullness. Maybe they don't repent right away, but like with a little bit of work, the Holy Spirit chips away, and then there's repentance, and they turn to the Lord, and then they're a totally different person. And you look at that, and you're like, wow, behold what God was able to do in that person's life. Which I don't know if we would really be in a position to say that anyway, because why would we say that about somebody else but not remember where we came from? You know what I'm saying? Wow, God was able to do that to him. Well, yeah, he was able to work with me. He was able to work with you. Was it because you were somewhat of an easier nut to crack, or that you were smarter or something like that? No, your heart was just as dead as that person that you're thinking about. And God was able to revive you. What makes you think he's not able to revive somebody else? Right? God's work continues. The work of the beast, whatever its manifestation is, and whatever the behavior of the dwellers of the earth who follow the beast, whatever that is, God is still at work, and he's still winning people, folks. He's still winning people. And the 144,000 is a visual testament of that in the book of Revelation. And then as they are described as first fruits, they're saying that, look, that's just an installment. That's just a first installment. We still got more to go here. So God's work continues, and there's people who are going to be saved. If there's any sort of encouragement, is as far as continuing, even when you're weary because you see all the things that are going on and people seem to be more against God than anything else, if there's any encouragement, let this be an encouragement to you. God is still working. And until he comes back, his work is going to continue. Okay? And even like, if you remember, even when we looked at in the middle of chapter 11, we saw the whole thing of how God continued to work, even as things were close to the end in that vision. And you had people coming to the Lord Jesus Christ. It's an amazing thing. And so, so God's work is not done. These 144,000 are first fruits. They were redeemed from mankind, redeemed, ransomed, purchased, whatever you want to use of that, from mankind as first fruits for God and to the Lamb. Verse 5, and in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless. Notice, no lie was found. What do we see in chapter 13? Deception all over the place. From the beast, from the dwellers of the earth who are buying into that sort of thing. If they're buying into that sort of thing, they have no problem speaking the same things that the beast does. And what is that? That's lies. That's deception. Here, the contrast is when the 144,000 is that in their mouths no lie was found. And this isn't something where this is a literal sort of thing where it says that these are Christians who never told a lie in their entire life. That's not the idea here. The idea here is to make the contrast between what you have in chapter 13 and what you have here. Deception, chapter 13, truth in chapter 14. And that truth and not lying is connected to who they understand their Lord to be and his message of the gospel and salvation and everything that surrounds that. The things that they speak on that is truth. It's not a lie. They're not looking to deceive anybody. They're looking to speak truth so that people can be rescued from deception. They can be rescued from lies that are being told to them from whatever the manifestation of the beast is in that particular time. Okay? So they speak the truth, and that's all connected to the newness of who they are, because it says there at the end, for they are blameless. I think that that's a description, that's a result of them being redeemed and being ransomed, okay? Because of their blamelessness, their blamelessness is something that explains why why there are people who speak the truth and they don't lie. And that not telling a lie and therefore being connected with truth is in connection to the Savior of whom they are connected, to whom they're connected. Okay. So there's the contrast there. Now, like I said before, there's still work to be done, but as we go on in chapter 14, we're going to see kind of a quickening of time here, because again, the whole thing is to show us, just how things work between the first and second comings of Christ leading up to that final end. Okay. Now we've seen two different visions of the end and so far in our study of Revelation. We're going to be coming up on another one here shortly in chapter 14, which we'll probably look at the episode after next. We're not going to look at it next time. It's probably going to come up in our study after next time. But even with what we're going to look at next time, we're going to see that there's still an appeal that is made to people to repent and to fear God. But as we also go on to say, time is running out. Time is running short. So time is of the essence. So a lot of interesting things that we're going to see here, but I hope that this is an encouragement to you. And I hope that this answers the question, so what? If we just read chapter 13 and then just leave things as they are, we leave things incomplete. Okay. But once we fill in the blanks here with what we see in chapter 14, we say, oh, okay, now we kind of see what's going on. This is contrast here. Whereas we saw this in chapter 13 here, in chapter 14, we see this. And it all points to the one important theme that I said is something that you see throughout the book of Revelation. It is something that we talked about way back in the beginning. And that is that Jesus Christ wins. Jesus Christ wins, and he's in control of this whole show. Again, remember at the very beginning of chapter 14, look, there's the Lamb, Mount Zion. We may have wondered, where is the Lamb? Where is God in all this? Oh, there he is. He hasn't gone anywhere. He's not far off. He's very much near. And the results of his program is seen in the 144,000. And with that 144,000, the message is given, you ain't seen nothing yet. There's more to come. Okay. And so that's what we have there. So hopefully that provides some clarity. Hopefully that provides some encouragement for you as well. As dark as chapter 13 appears to be, there's light in chapter 14. Okay. So we will leave it there for now. We will pick up in verse 6 next time. If you enjoy this show and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts, also on iHeartRadio, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow me, Steve Gill, on Twitter. The handle is at LTScripts. That's LTSERIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And don't forget to order a copy of my book, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? You can get that on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. All right. Well, I had a great time examining Scripture, as I always do. Again, like I said, I think there's some good things in store for us in the verses ahead in this chapter. And I'm sure it'll be truly a blessing as the rest of this study has been up to this point. Well, my name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.